Good afternoon, and welcome to the Cardiovascular Research Institute's webinar entitled Understanding Cardiovascular Disease from Genetics to Lifestyle. I'd like to thank Sinai's development team for putting this together, and I would like to thank all of you for joining us here this afternoon for what I hope will be an informative, exciting, and scintillating 1 hour of discussion, really touching on these themes related to genetics and lifestyle of cardiovascular disease. So just by way of introduction, the Cardiovascular Research Institute is Sinai's hub for fundamental or basic cardiovascular science, as well as translational cardiovascular science. And it is the home to research scientists, to physician scientists, who collectively engage in cardiovascular science to better understand cardiovascular disease that will hopefully lead to the treatments of tomorrow. My name is Phil Swirski. I am the director of the Cardiovascular Research Institute. I am also the Janet and Arthur C. Ross Professor of Medicine and Cardiology, and I hold secondary appointments at the Precision Immunology Institute, the Friedman Brain Institute, and the Biomedical Imaging Institute. I am joining me today are two investigators, two members of the Cardiovascular Research Institute, Dr. Amy Kontorovich, who is the medical director of the Adult Cardiovascular Genetics in the Zina and Michael Wiener Cardiovascular Institute. She's also the director at the Center for Inherited Cardiovascular Disease and Associate Professor of Cardiology and Genomic Medicine at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Joining me also is Dr. Cameron McAlpine, who is Assistant Professor of Medicine and Cardiology and Assistant Professor of Neuroscience at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and he is also a member of Cardiovascular Research Institute, as well as a member of the Friedman Brain Institute and the Lipschultz Immunology Institute. So I would just, in a few minutes, want to set the stage and really provide context for today. What I would like to do is first spend a little bit of time to contextualizing what we mean by genetics and lifestyle in the context of cardiovascular disease. And then I will ask Amy and Cameron to speak more concretely about the work that they do, about the work that is generally done at the Cardiovascular Research Institute that really touches on some of these themes. And after that, we will have a series of questions that you provided. And please, if you have any additional questions, use the Q&A button. And while we have already quite a lot of questions, and thus we may not be able to answer all of them, we will certainly try our best to answer as many as we can. So let me just start, what I want to, by way of context and really at a high level, what do we mean by genetics and what do we mean by lifestyle factors? So there are many ways that you can think about genetics, inheritance, family history. And on the one hand, one can think of diseases where there is one mutation in one gene. And if you have that mutation, you will get that disease. These are so-called monogenic diseases. Some of the ones that perhaps are most familiar are diseases such as cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, Huntington's is one, Tay-Sachs disease. And really, these are diseases that you're born with. It's a mutation for a particular gene that has some vital function. And without this function, it manifests itself as that particular disease. But there are also mutations that can occur in our genes that by themselves do not give you the disease, but may modulate the risk of that disease. And when we think about heart disease, cardiovascular disease, and there are different types of heart diseases, that we will, and Amy will talk about this, and many of them really are diseases that involve such mutations that do not, again, in themselves mean that you will definitely acquire this disease, but they can modulate the risk. They can either elevate risk or protect you against the disease. And so there is this idea of sort of polygenic diseases where multiple little mutations in various genes collectively can either elevate risk for cardiovascular disease or protect you against cardiovascular disease. And this is what we talk about, sort of polygenic risk score that you might have heard about. And then the critical thing here is that this does not, I just want to emphasize this, this does not mean that you will get the disease, but it tells you a little bit about risk for acquiring such a disease later in life. Now, on the other hand, is lifestyle. Another way we can think of it is environment. There is another term that, as you might hear from time to time, called the exposome, which is a term that encompasses various exposures throughout life. One can think of personal exposomes such as sleep, diet, exercise, stress, or more general exposomes like climate, whether we live in an urban or rural environment, pollution, noise, various social stressors. And these also either elevate or protect us against cardiovascular disease. And it is really this tension between nature and nurture that is at the heart of what we want to talk about today. As we are learning, for example, that if one were to exercise the so-called life's essential 8 or control life's essential 8, which is to say, consume a healthy diet, exercise regularly, do not smoke, get healthy sleep, manage your weight, and then also control cholesterol, blood sugar, manage blood pressure. If you can do that ideally, you can essentially beat the odds of having elevated risk, elevated genetic risk. And we are also learned that lifestyle factors can induce mutations. So there is always an interplay or a crosstalk between, on the one hand, genetics, and on the other hand, lifestyle factors. And so work done at the CVRI, and we'll hear from 2 investigators, are really focusing on this crosstalk. On the one hand, to understand how various mutations can influence the risk for cardiovascular disease. And on the other hand, understand how we can modulate that risk by engaging in healthy lifestyles. And so what I would like to now ask is Amy to speak to this and to the work that she is doing at the CVRI. Amy.
Thanks, Phil. Hi, everyone. Well, that was a great introduction to what I wanted to discuss about genetics. So you've just heard about the distinction between the type of heart diseases that we think of as being monogenic, being caused by a high impact genetic change or mutation in usually a single gene, and then the polygenic diseases that have a root cause in multiple small genetic variations that sort of collectively increase risk. We know that about 1 in 20 people carry some type of rare genetic variant that puts them at risk for a condition that can affect the heart. And in a clinical setting, we use genetic testing every day to try to figure out who is at risk for certain diseases and try to help inform a personalized medicine approach to their care, as well as to determine who else in a family might be at risk, whether they know it or not. In other words, they could have a silent risk. They could be carrying a high-risk genetic trait, but they may not be manifesting symptoms yet. But we also know that not everyone who carries these type of high-risk genetic variants or mutations will go on to develop the disease, and we don't have great tools to identify among people who have a high-risk genetic result who will then go on to develop disease and who will remain well and healthy. And as Phil said, there's probably environmental and exposure factors that influence that. And I'll give you an example of a well-studied phenomenon. So there's a gene called titin. It's called titin because it's the largest protein that we have in our cells, and it's encoded by a gene called titin. And people can have a mutation or a change in a titin gene, and most of the time will not develop any heart disease. So there are many silent carriers of titin mutations. But it turns out that upon exposure to certain environmental triggers, pregnancy, alcohol, viruses, certain types of chemotherapy, the heart disease can be turned on, and it occurs more often in people who have mutations in this titin gene than in others. So that's something that we're looking into, and I'll explain in just a minute about how we explore the association between titin and environmental risks. But another example of the interaction between genetics and environment has to do with exercise, and it's not what you think. So there turns out to be a set of genes where if you have a mutation in one of those genes, the risk of exercise is greater. So you actually are at an increased risk for heart problems when you exercise with this particular rare genetic variation. Now, I'm not suggesting that people stop exercising at all, but this is just to emphasize the point that there needs to be a personalized approach to decision making, and some people don't have the same benefits and in fact can have harms from exercise. So how do we go about researching this? I'll give you an example. In my lab, we use a model for myocarditis. This is an inflammatory heart disease in which we can take stem cells that either come from patients, typically they come from patients, we can turn them into heart cells. And we can control the genetics of those cells. So we know which cells have mutations in specific genes that we're interested in studying. And then we can expose the heart cells to viruses, for example, and test to see whether having a different genetic background leads those cells to behave differently. Do they have arrhythmia features? Do they die more quickly? Do they reproduce the virus in a different way? Do they have a different immune profile? So we've been doing these types of studies for a number of years, but recently my laboratory and Cameron's laboratory have been joining forces to collaborate to answer some of these questions. And furthermore, to try to understand, one of our goals is to understand how not only viruses lead to heart impairment in people who have certain genetic predisposition, but also how exercise plays into that as well. And we're starting to move these myocarditis models into mice. So I think that's a good transition maybe to talking about some of Cameron's work, and happy to answer questions later.
Cameron, please.
So thank you very much, Phil and Amy. And I think that was a great transition to some of the work that is being done in my lab, which really centers on understanding the impact of lifestyle on cardiovascular disease. And so, as you might appreciate, your lifestyle, such as how much you sleep, how often you exercise, how many fruits and vegetables you eat, has a significant impact on your risk of developing cardiovascular disease. Despite this knowledge, we actually know very little about the fundamental biological mechanisms by which lifestyle can influence heart health and cardiovascular risk. And here at the Cardiovascular Research Institute, my team, along with many others, including collaborations with Amy and Phil, we're uncovering these new biological mechanisms by which sleep and exercise can impact your health. And so, as both Amy and Phil have mentioned, your genetics and lifestyle can influence your risk for disease. And Amy has eloquently explained that what we are learning about how specific DNA mutations alter your risk for cardiovascular disease. But at an individual level, both genetics and environmental lifestyle impact and interact to actually influence and co-opt biological function and ultimately predispose any given individual to risk for disease. And as Amy mentioned, our teams here at the CVRI are studying these important interactions between genetics and lifestyle. And to give you another example of our investigations into gene-environment interactions is some of the work being done in my lab on what is called somatically acquired mutations. As Amy explained, our genetic code that is imprinted from birth and passed down to us from our parents can influence our risk for cardiovascular disease. However, cells in our body, particularly cells that are part of the immune system, can actually acquire genetic mutations over our lifetime as we age. These acquired mutations are what are referred to as somatic mutations. And in many cases, these acquired mutations can cause things like cancer. But we're actually learning that they can also influence cardiovascular disease and your risk for developing cardiovascular disease. And so my lab is studying how lifestyles such as sleep and exercise calibrate the biological effect of these acquired somatic mutations. To give you an example of this, we've actually found that disrupted or fragmented sleep can augment the detrimental effects that these acquired mutations have on our heart and our immune system. On the other hand, regular exercise can actually blunt the damaging effects of these mutations. And so we believe that lifestyle can act as this calibrator and modulate the biological effect of these acquired somatic mutations and their influence on our cardiovascular health. And finally, another aspect of my research program is better understanding the connections between the brain and heart, with a particular focus on how sleep can actually modulate brain-heart communication. We know that sufficient sleep keeps both our brain and our heart healthy. For example, while you sleep, your brain clears itself of metabolites and toxins. Sleep can also obviously restore energy and help imprint memories. But what my lab and many others are discovering is that while you sleep, your brain can also signal to your immune system to keep it healthy and youthful. Some of the effects that sleep has, for example, on our brain and its neurons can actually then have downstream consequences on our immune and cardiovascular systems. Our studies suggest, for example, that insufficient or poor quality sleep actually increases your risk for inflammation and deteriorates your immune system, which raises your risk for a heart attack. Further, recent data from my lab has demonstrated that a heart attack can actually then have consequential, profound changes in your brain, including the induction of brain inflammation. And actually what we're learning is that this brain inflammation that ensues after a heart attack is actually a protective and beneficial response that increases sleep and allows your heart to recover and repair itself after a heart attack. And so as you might imagine, to conduct this multidisciplinary research, it requires a team of experts in neuroscience and genetics and cardiology and immunology. And here at the CVRI, we're bringing these experts such as Phil and Amy together to tackle some of these important and fundamental questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron and Amy. Two of the investigators at CVRI, many others from various disciplines who really work in this area. And one take-home message here is that it's really not about genetics versus lifestyle or genetics or lifestyle. This is a false dichotomy. We are learning that one influences the other, and it really, this is an age-old tension, nature versus nurture, but really understanding how nature and nurture intersect and influence one another, we think is a key to really understanding cardiovascular health and cardiovascular disease. So please include your questions in the Q&A. We already have a few here, but I will start with some of the questions that were asked earlier by the audience members. So the first question actually to Amy. So you say that 1 in 20 people are at increased genetic risk for heart disease. So, when you go to the doctor's office, should you be getting a genetic test? What would that look like? How can we have information about our polygenic risk score? What are some of the things that can be done at this point in time, and what should we be doing?
Sure, yeah. So I think a good way to distinguish the answer is to think differently about genetic testing and genomic screening. So genetic testing is a tool that's used in diagnostics for people typically who have a condition, or if you know that a disease runs in the family and there's a particular mutation that runs in the family, we use genetic testing to determine who else in that family carries that trait and might be at risk. But genomic screening is an emerging approach that is being actively investigated. This is a concept where you take healthy people who don't have symptoms of any particular disease, and you just see, do they carry a high impact genetic variant that would warrant plugging them into the healthcare system for further clinical testing to watch for signs and symptoms of any disease that could be associated with that gene. For example, this is done with cancer genetic testing. So for the BRCA genes, genomic screening is now part of a implementation pipeline that's recommended by the United States Preventive Task Force's services. And other cancer screening tests are recommended. So it's conceivable that this approach might one day be within our clinical care for cardiovascular genes, but we're not there right now. So people can get genomic screening tests on their own. They can use commercially available tests. We call that direct to consumer. But I always recommend that if you get a direct to consumer test, you talk to a specialist about the results to help you with the interpretation.
Thank you, Amy. All right, so a question now for Cameron. You later on when you were speaking, you mentioned the links between the brain and heart. Sort of the two most important organs, the heart and brain. Well, as we age, might neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's impact these links and alter cardiovascular disease? Can you speak to that a little bit, please?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're actually learning more and more about the commonalities between cardiovascular disease and neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, recent data has begun to suggest that Alzheimer's disease at least has a component of dysfunctional vasculature or blood vessels in your brain. And as a consequence, various inflammatory and immune disruptions occur in the brain. And so there appears to be this link between vascular health and the pathologies of Alzheimer's disease and neurodegeneration. And of course, much work is still needed to better research and study this area. But we think that potentially there are common biological mechanisms that drive both cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's disease.
Thank you, Cameron. So another question, maybe I'll tackle this one, is what therapies already exist to modulate the two, and what therapies can we envision will come along. So of course, we know that there are many different types of therapies for cardiovascular disease. We also, of course, have statins like Crestor. We have antihypertensive medicines, losartan, for example, that comes to mind as an angiotensin II receptor blocker. There are beta blockers. There are all sorts of medicines for diabetes. Of course, we've heard of semaglutide or Ozempic, the GLP-1 receptor agonists, metformin, SGLT2 inhibitors, and so on. The list goes on and on. And studying cardiovascular disease with this attention to lifestyle and genetics allows us to potentially discover pathways that can be druggable and targetable, about which we did not know much about. So one example, for example, is that if we look at how sleep protects us against cardiovascular disease, or its disruption elevates risk, or stress or diet, by studying these processes, what we are discovering is that various pathways that are not currently being targeted are important. So we are in a way learning from nature, which is to say we're learning how sleep is protecting us. And one of the things we're discovering is that sleep has a major effect, and Cameron spoke to this, on inflammation, on the immune system. The immune system is a highly targetable system. And so there's an opportunity in the future to consider therapies that target some of these pathways, including the cardiovascular system, to treat cardiovascular disease. So let's continue with sort of a next round of questions. I just want to be also mindful of time, and I also see that people are putting the questions in the Q&A, so I will come to those in a minute. But just sort of another question, Amy, could you explain a little bit more about sort of what personal medicine approach is? What does that mean?
Yeah, that can mean a lot of different things, but in genetic heart disease, what it means is people can have similar presentations. They can have similar sets of symptoms, similar imaging appearance. So a lot of times in cardiology, we do imaging tests like an ultrasound of the heart, an echocardiogram, or cardiac MRI or CAT scan. And two different people can have the same abnormality on an imaging test, but their disease can be driven in quite different ways on the molecular level. And that can be determined through genetic testing. And when we do that type of genetic investigation and we identify certain genotypes that drive the disease, there may be medicines or treatment approaches, maybe different surgical thresholds for certain conditions that are dictated by the genetics. So this is a really good example of how personalized medicine is used today for patients who have aortic aneurysms at the top of their aorta, thoracic aortic aneurysms. And this was one question I see in the Q&A about risk factors. So genetics are a risk factor for those types of aortic aneurysms. Again, the aneurysm may appear the same on a CAT scan for two different people, but with one set of genes, it would be considered high risk, and perhaps that person would need surgery imminently. And for the other person with the exact same size aortic aneurysm, but a different set of genetic underpinnings, they may be able to sort of watch and wait.
Thank you, Amy. Cameron, people often fluctuate between periods in their life when they are sleeping well, periods when they sleep poorly because of family, work, or other obligations. How do these fluctuations in sleep influence your immune system and risk for cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question, because we know that we change our sleep habits and patterns throughout our lifetime. Of course, for example, newborns sleep quite a bit versus as you age, you sleep less and less. And further, even during periods of your life, for example, you might have a young one in your home, or you might go through a period of time when you're quite stressed with obligations and work and things like that, and you may not sleep quite as well. And so we're really aiming to study how these fluctuations in your sleep pattern over your lifetime can alter your risk for these chronic age-related diseases like cardiovascular disease. And intriguingly, actually, what we're discovering is that sleep can not only have an immediate impact on your immune system and your cardiovascular system, but it can actually imprint your cells for potentially long-term detrimental effects. So what we've discovered is that even a short bout of insufficient or poor quality sleep, say for a period of a few weeks or a few months, can actually have long-term effects on your cells and on your immune system, even if you return to a healthy sleep pattern. And so much more work needs to be done to better understand how these fluctuations in sleep ultimately predispose an individual to long-term risk. But so far, the data really suggests that even short periods of insufficient sleep can actually have very long-lasting effects on your health, really reinforcing again the importance of sleep and to maintain good quality sleep as much as you can.
And Cameron, I just want to follow up because I will start now to look at the questions that are in the Q&A. So there's a question right now in the Q&A that I think sort of follows up to what you just said. So the question is, from what I heard, is that fragmented sleep is not good. So if you sleep for a few hours and then awake for a while, there is a problem, I guess. So maybe that sort of speaks to sleep quality and sleep quantity. Can you speak about this a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So there's many ways by which sleep can be disrupted. You can have fragmented sleep where you're waking often throughout the night versus you could have short amounts of consolidated sleep, but then are awake for longer periods. And what's intriguing from a biological perspective is that these different types of interrupted or shortened sleep can actually have very different consequences. And so we're beginning to learn that the underlying biology of your sleep habits can actually influence your risk for disease in slightly different ways. But again, at the end of the day, the fundamental message is that you want to achieve 7 to 8 hours of regular sleep each night. And you want to aim to actually have a very consistent sleep schedule such that you're going to bed and waking up at approximately the same time every day. And any deviations from those parameters really will be detrimental to your health, whether that's short sleep or fragmented sleep or even irregular patterns in sleep, even though you may be receiving 7 to 8 hours every night on average. An irregular sleep pattern can also have impact your health. So we're learning more and more about this every day. But as I said, I think the take-home message is to try to get regular and sufficient sleep as much as you can.
And what I would add to this, there is a lot of questions that are often asked, and there are a few in the Q&A, asking for specific recipes, which is to say, how much should I be eating? How much should I be sleeping? How much should I be exercising? And it's difficult sometimes to parse out to really get sort of a clear answer. In part, it's difficult to get a clear answer is that we don't know many of these things. There's a lot of information out there about calorie restriction. We certainly know that one should be sleeping 7 to 9 hours, but people have different sleep needs. There's, of course, questions about exercise. Maybe we'll get to some of this in just a little bit. But one thing that one can say is, well, there's really two things that I would like to bring to this conversation regarding questions about dosage and recipes for what is the ideal diet or the ideal exercise regimen. The first one is that we are all different. What works for one person may not work for another person. So this also gets to this question of precision medicine. Amy spoke about a mutation that can, of course, confer risk during exercise. So it's important that we listen to our bodies and not just blindly follow what may be a particular fad or trend or prescription for a healthy diet. And the other thing I think that is important to say is a good rule of thumb is and has been a moderation dosage. So just think about what are some things too extreme. So one example could be that I'll give a very concrete example about sort of moderation. There is plenty of evidence that some level of caloric restriction has health benefits. But you can sort of imagine that, eventually with too much caloric restriction or too much fasting, you are entering a very unhealthy zone of essentially starving yourself. And so finding that moderation and understanding yourself, appreciating that everyone is different, I think is a good heuristic and a good rule of thumb. But of course, there are certain things that can be said that we should be doing. We should always be exercising and sleeping well and so on. All right, so let me let me take another question from the Q&A. This one is for Amy. Does everyone have genetic mutations and acquired somatic mutations?
Okay, maybe I'll let Cameron answer the one about the acquired somatic mutations. That might be more in his territory. But as far as does everyone have genetic mutations that they're born with, everyone, almost everyone, probably has genetic variation that differs from their peer, their neighbor, their family members, even their parents. So we learn the rule of thumb in our biology classes that you inherit one set of your genes. Every gene comes as a pair, so you inherit one set of your traits from your mom, one set of your traits from your dad. And by and large, that's true, but there's also subtle variants that occur that are what make us unique from our parents. And most people will have a unique trait. The question is that a mutation? Because not every change in a gene or variation in a gene impacts the function of the gene to cause a problem that can lead to disease. So does everyone have mutations? Probably not. But if people get genetic testing, there's a high likelihood that a genetic variation will be discovered. And so one of the reasons that I recommend that genetic testing be interpreted by specialists is because you want someone to weigh in on whether that variation is the type that causes disease or whether it's just benign white noise in the system.
Cameron, do you have anything to add?
Sure, I can speak very briefly about acquired mutations. So again, these are mutations that you are not born with, that are not passed down to you from your parents, but rather potentially accumulate as you age. And this often occurs because as we grow and as we age, our cells in our bodies are dividing. We're constantly dividing to produce healthy tissue. And through that process, small mutations can occur. Most of the time, these mutations are eliminated. So if a cell acquires such a mutation, it's often destroyed and eliminated in order to keep the tissue and organ healthy. But once in a while, that doesn't happen. And those mutations can become ingrained in the tissue. And ultimately, those cells that have acquired that mutation can have potentially detrimental effects. Although, as Amy explained, most mutations actually have a null effect and do not actually influence the function of the cell. But then to answer the question, certainly the answer is no. Not everybody has those acquired mutations, but some people do. And in those in which those acquired mutations have been instilled, there can be influence on your health and your disease. But certainly we don't believe that everybody would have those.
Thank you, Cameron. So I have another question. This one is for Amy from one of our guests, and I think it also touches a little bit to what we were saying about earlier, and something that I think many of us think about. So if you are on a statin, let's say, and your cholesterol is now very low, let's say it's less than 150, your LDL is less than 70, can you increase your consumption of processed foods and red meats if you continue to monitor your full lipid panel? I mean, is it open season for eating red meat at that point?
Well, I like what you said just a few moments ago about moderation. So I don't think you would find a cardiologist out there who's willing to give people carte blanche to eat whatever they want, whenever they want, because there's more to the risks of saturated fats and red meat than just the cholesterol alone and the effects on lipid levels alone. Being on a statin is a good idea for people who have high cholesterol. It has many different effects beyond just lowering the cholesterol, and it certainly affords protection. There's more and more evidence to suggest that the lower you can drive the LDL cholesterol level, which is the bad cholesterol, the better. And so even at a LDL of less than 70 or 70, 60 something, one could make the argument that you can afford to go lower, especially if you already have coronary artery disease. So I always say moderation. I agree with that sentiment. I think it's okay to celebrate and have a hamburger here and there, but not to develop a habit of making that the mainstay of your diet.
Thank you, Amy. So we have another question. I want to, in just a moment, move on to another sort of cluster or themes pertaining to comorbidities. But before we go there, there's one question here. I think, Cameron, this you may want to take this one. It's I imagine you might speak about clonal hematopoiesis. And the question is, what is the impact of genetics/mutations on plaque buildup and retention? This is from one of our guests joining us today.
Yeah. So this question again, it gets back to this concept of mutations that build up over your lifetime, and I kind of hopefully provided a bit of a surface level explanation of this process. But to answer this question, we need to maybe think about this in a bit more detail, and that's specific to these mutations that actually accumulate in your immune system, in your white blood cells, and often these somatic mutations occur in white blood cells because we're constantly producing millions, in fact, billions of white blood cells every day. So it's estimated that in a healthy human, about 4 billion white blood cells are produced every day. In order for this process to occur, these cells have to divide. You have stem cells actually in your bones, in your bone marrow. You have stem cells that produce all of the white blood cells. And because these stem cells are undergoing proliferation and dividing so frequently, mutations can often creep up and occur. And when this happens, this is referred to as clonal hematopoiesis. And again, this is a process where these mutations have been acquired. And what's interesting is that these mutations, although they begin in the stem cells, they actually get passed down as those stem cells differentiate into mature functional white blood cells. And those white blood cells can actually then migrate into the plaques, what we call atherosclerotic plaques that build up in your vessels. And so these are the lipid-engorged, lipid-filled, immune cell-filled plaques that can develop within the walls of your arteries. And when a cell with a mutation has migrated to this location, to the plaque, it can actually have many harmful effects within the vessel wall. So it can increase proliferation, it can cause more lipid to be deposited there, and ultimately it can cause that plaque to become unstable. And if the plaque is unstable and it ruptures, that's where you get things like a heart attack or a stroke. And so these mutations that start in the bone marrow and start in stem cells in your bone marrow ultimately make their way through white blood cells to the growing plaques in your vasculature and can have many of these detrimental effects. And so that's kind of the link between these acquired mutations to the plaque. And as I explained earlier, what we're actually learning, although this sounds terrible, we're actually learning your lifestyle can actually influence this process. And so things like exercise can actually limit the detrimental effects that these white blood cells with the mutations have. And so again, it's this tension between these acquired mutations and your lifestyle, but ultimately both can influence this process of these white blood cells impacting your atherosclerotic plaques.
And one concept here that is also worth mentioning is this idea of the compression of morbidity. So the idea here is that we will all die, but we may not. But the question is, can we reduce the duration of disease? Can we limit? And this is the idea of compressing morbidity by exercising good lifestyle habits, but really following these life's essential aid. We have an opportunity to compress or limit the number of years that we may live with disease. And really, I think this is a major sort of focus of a lot of the work. So in the last few minutes, because our time is running short, I just want to touch on another theme that has already come up when we talked about the relationship between the brain and the heart. And that is generally this idea of comorbidities, how one disease influences another. The heart and the cardiovascular system it doesn't exist in isolation. It is influenced by other systems. It is influenced by other diseases, and it influences other diseases. And there are two questions that were asked by our guests that I just want to briefly touch on. So one is and I'll just read the question, as long-term effects of COVID-19 on the heart emerge, what can you tell us about how tracing that connection matters for the treatment of non-ischemic disease? Should post-viral heart problems be treated differently? So this is really a question about the relationship between infection, viral infection, whether it's the COVID-19 virus or even influenza and cardiovascular disease, and how should we be thinking about this? And this is exactly some of the work that is being done at the CVRI, is understanding those connections. As we're understanding how a virus, for example, engages the immune system, induces inflammation, and induces very specific elements, very specific programs in the overall inflammatory landscape that then damages the heart. And if we can understand what those programs are, that will help us to then treat the damage to the heart in response to viral infection. Another example of this is a second question that came up that was very much in this theme. And the question is, what is the relationship between mild autoimmune disease and cardiovascular disease, and how should we be thinking about this? So there's no question it's that autoimmune disease elevates risk for cardiovascular disease, and it's exactly research into how this happens that investigators here are engaged in. And what we're discovering, for example, is that again it has to do with the immune system, with inflammation. Autoimmune disease is a disease of the immune system, and this damages vessels and elevates risk. And we certainly don't understand everything. There is a lot to learn, but this just illustrates that there is much crosstalk between systems and between diseases. So we just have a few minutes left. So maybe this is an opportunity to ask our panelists, Amy and Cameron, if they have any final thoughts, anything that they would like to just touch on that perhaps wasn't yet covered before we part our ways. Amy.
Sure. Yeah, I'll make a plug to talk to your family members about their health. It's not something that everyone always feels so comfortable doing. Several years ago, Thanksgiving Day was designated as National Family History Day. And it speaks to the importance of knowing what conditions run in the family, because for many people, those are the diseases that they are at a heightened risk for. And that's often the first step in determining whether someone would benefit from genetic testing or whether there's a different approach that needs to be taken. So talk to your relatives, find out what diseases run in the family.
Thank you, Amy. No, that's great. And Cameron?
So along, similar lines to Amy, I will put a plug for, considering your lifestyle in your overall health. I think, many people often think of and know of the importance of diet and exercise and not smoking. But, sleep is a very important factor. And we're learning a lot more about sleep. In fact, all of us should be asleep for a third of our life. And this has really important consequences on your health. And it's not often that your cardiologist asks you, how well you're sleeping. And so I would encourage everybody to really consider this as a very important factor, just as important as diet and exercise, and to really, take stock of your sleep habits and your sleep quality, both for yourself and, of course, your family members.
And I will just say one last thing, and there's a question that just came in, which I want to answer. How do you best reduce inflammation? So I think that sort of touches on a lot of the things that we've been talking about. Healthy lifestyle reduces inflammation. Good sleep reduces inflammation. Exercise reduces inflammation. There are drugs to reduce inflammation, and certainly there have been drugs that have been tested targeting inflammation in cardiovascular disease. Colchicine is one, antibodies against IL-1, which is a cardinal inflammatory cytokine or modulator of inflammation. And there's a lot of work that is being done in laboratories around the world and in laboratories at the Cardiovascular Research Institute that are really trying to understand how to reduce inflammation and in general, how to target various systems that elevate a risk for cardiovascular disease, whether those systems are sort of controlled genetically or through lifestyle, and really better understanding that intersection and that conversation between lifestyle factors or the environment and genetics, or sort of nature versus nurture. So this really leads us to the end of our webinar. So just before you log off, I just have one final important point to leave you with. All the research and innovative ways that we're thinking about better understanding cardiovascular health and cardiovascular disease is made possible because of the extraordinary power of philanthropy. You know, we are research scientists who really want to understand how the body works and want to make the world a healthier place. But it requires resources, and philanthropy is an extraordinarily important part of that. The work has just begun, and we need help to give these talented leaders the resources they need to keep innovating. So there's a special QR code, or so-called flow code, that will be on the screen. You can point your smartphone camera, and it'll take you to a web page where you can support this urgent work. So finally, just thank you all for your interest. I hope that this has been interesting, stimulating 1 hour. We very much value of your interest, your engagement, your questions, which are always great for scientists and physician science to hear. And it's really certainly been fun for us this afternoon, and hopefully you've enjoyed yourself as well. So thank you very much, and have a pleasant rest of the day.